inter-regional trade, inter-investments across the border. But I feel, and again, I'd be very keen to hear what my panelists think, we can't take that for granted anymore. So there are tensions. China is now a much more rising power and probably a more assertive power. How will that play out? US is retreating from its traditional views and positions, certainly from Pivot Asia. And India and China, as the large superpowers, not only in this continent but globally, India will become world's second largest economy in PPP terms by 2040, is already third largest. China is the largest. India will become the most populous country by 1922. Sorry, it's 2022. 2022. I'm a century behind. And so the two countries, most populous, number one and number two, economically the largest, number one and number two. The elephant and the dragon have to learn to dance with each other. They can't trample each other. And of course, Japan will remain important in spite of its declining population. It is now the world's third largest economy in nominal terms, fourth in purchasing power parity, but it will still in 2050 still be one of the top 10. So Japan, China, India, Korea, part of a multipolar regime in Asia, will obviously have to drive this process. Let me then conclude by saying, so within Asia, in spite of the significant challenges, I'm optimistic. And I'm optimistic because Asia is still a relatively young continent, large population, increasingly innovative, well-educated, large market size, general macroeconomic stability, and pursuing open regionalism for the last 40 years. South Asia hasn't done so well, but certainly Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia have integrated much better. But as Shekhar says, and as we've said in the book, it's important to not look at it through rose-tinted glasses. The prospect of an Asian century is based on assumption that Asia can manage the major economic and security challenges. I think this is a new thing. We have taken our security and our peace and stability a bit too much for granted, and it serves us well. And those have to be managed, and if they are managed, then my answer to the question in the book's title, Asia's question mark, the answer from my point of view is plausible but not periodic. Thank you very much.
So now I'm going to quickly turn to my two distinguished panelists and request them for some opening reflections on the book. I should say that both had, and we had the privilege of both commenting on two lectures. Shyam commented on the lecture that was on the fourth lecture, which was on regional cooperation and integration. And Sanjay, of course, commented on the last lecture, which was on clean and green growth. So let me turn first to Shyam Saran and ask him for his opening reflections.
Rajat, for publishing this book, which is based on the 6 lectures that he had given on the Asian century. And as Shekhar said, I was very privileged to be a discussant for one of his lectures. I thought I'll just confine my opening remarks to just perhaps raising a few questions. Rajat has talked about, is there going to be an Asian century? I think perhaps hidden in that is another question, is this going to be a Chinese century? And certainly if we look at the 19th Party Congress, which has just concluded, and the statements of the Chinese leader, who's now the core leader, but he's also a leader whose philosophy and thought is now incorporated in the Chinese constitution itself. Not only is he speaking about perhaps being the most important country in Asia, but he's talking about how China has ambitions to really be at the very center of the new world order which is emerging. So I think when we are talking about an Asian century, I think we have to also really look at whether or not the ambitions which China has, which is based on, as Rajat himself has recognized, spectacular growth over the last few decades. So the prospect of an Asian century is very closely linked with China's performance. We can't even begin to talk about an Asian century unless we take the Chinese component as part and parcel of this. The other aspect, of course, is that mention was made by Shekhar as to the and Rajat that much of this very spectacular growth that we have experienced in Asia has been very much linked to the existence of relative peace and security in the region. And that peace and security in the region, to a large extent, has been linked to a very formidable forward presence by the United States forces. Its alliance structure, the hubs and spokes alliance structure in the region. And there is a very little doubt that even though US remains a very formidable power, there is a relative decline in its ability to influence events in this region because of the change in the balance of power, again linked to the emergence of China as a major power with significant economic and military capabilities in this region. Now, what will that mean? Because as we know from history, it is periods of transition which are the most risky periods. And there is no doubt that we are going through a transition. Therefore, a lot of the existing conflicts in the region, hotspots as we mentioned, they were managed. They were not resolved, but they were managed so that they did not become a hot war. Are we going to see that situation still continue? You have the example today of what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. It has become a major flashpoint, and yes, there is a risk that it may descend into a war that nobody wants, but may be unavoidable. Several of the latent conflicts or adversarial relations amongst countries are also now surfacing, and India-China is a classic example of that. Whereas 10 years ago, there was perhaps some kind of a consensus between India and China that they had greater convergence of interest in shaping the emerging order. And in that context, their bilateral disputes became lesser in salience. Today, the opposite is happening. That the sense, certainly on the Chinese side, a sense that there is a certain convergence of interests on issues of regional and global significance that is no longer as salient. So the dragon elephant tango, as I think has been mentioned in one of the Chinese, I think last time when Prime Minister was meeting Xi Jinping in Xiamen, I think they talked about the need for the dragon and the elephant to tango. I'm not so sure. They will keep stepping on each other's toes as they dance. So we are facing a rather unusual situation in this transition. And to add to that, of course, this is the backdrop against which all the challenges that Rajat has with tremendous amount of, the appeal to data, the very detailed data he has given, all those will play out against that geopolitical backdrop. And so I really think that for India, perhaps it is not so much a question of whether this is going to be an Asian century, which of course you would recall that Deng Xiaoping had said when Rajiv Gandhi had gone to Beijing for his visit, that there cannot be an Asian century without this rise of both India and China. That does not seem to be the Chinese assessment today. The implications of that is what we have to really consider today as we go into these questions. Thank you for your attention.
So, Shyam has already contemporized the discussion, and I think we are in very good hands here with certainly him, but I'm going to turn to Sanjay as well for his comments.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. First of all, thank you, Rajat, for having me here. Rajat and I have engaged each other on this subject for some years now, and I've greatly benefited from my conversations with him, from reading his chapters, which I've done over the last couple of years. And therefore, I'm privileged, feel privileged to be here at the launch of a book that I believe should be read. First of all, let me say, since I'm here to provoke some discussion, let me try and be a bit provocative, Rajat, if you don't mind. I tend to be generally. Well, I think this book is a great assessment of the positives and the negatives of Asia as we see it today. And Rajat, in fact, has summarized all of that, the strengths and the weaknesses. And for every student of economics, this will be a very valuable book to read to understand where Asia is. It is also an important assessment of the kind of challenges that we face. Having said that, I question both the correlations and the extrapolations. Let me explain. This year, 2017, is the centenary of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. Would anybody have said in 1917 that the 20th century would be the American century? Some may have, but I'm not actually sure. There's not enough evidence to suggest that the 20th century by 1917 was taking shape in a manner in which Europe's dominance would decline and America's would increase. The British Empire was very much intact in 1917. And Russia was the new hope for large parts of the world. It had triggered revolutions around the world. In 1917, Rajat Nag could well have said that the Soviet Union would be the inheritor of the mantle of the British Empire and not the United States. So extrapolations are dangerous. Second, the correlations. The reason I say extrapolations are dangerous is because of the correlations. Just to give a couple of examples. Corruption. Is there a relationship between growth and corruption? It's not a fashionable thing to say. It's very difficult to find it. I remember speaking at the Hindu Book Festival last year and saying, look at Tamil Nadu and look at West Bengal. 30 years of left front rule in West Bengal, corruption-free, honest chief ministers, Jyoti Basu, Buddhadev Bhattacharya. You could not have had more honest team of leaders. And look at Tamil Nadu, 30 years of utter corruption, Karunanidhi, Jayalalitha, MGR, the worst. And which state is better off in terms of development, industrialization, agriculture? I can think of China. China in Mao's time, less corruption. China under post-Deng, more corruption. China under post-Deng has done much better. So this relationship between good governance, corruption, has become a buzzword. But I'm a cynic, I don't accept it. You can have very corrupt regimes doing, undertaking policies that can actually contribute. But you make an extremely important point, which I think is central to a lot of your arguments, which is, apart from the fact that corruption is inequalizing, that inequality is a challenge. And to the extent corruption is inequalizing, it does pose a challenge to growth. That inequalities, particularly in Asia and particularly in India, you cannot sustain growth without reducing inequality. I think that relationship between inequality, poverty, and growth is extremely important. And China has tried to address it in a way which we have not. And till you address that challenge, I don't think. But again, let me say something completely unfashionable: gender equality. Neither Europe nor United States had gender equality in the period in which they were rising. Now, it is true that these are desirable objectives of any civilized society. reducing corruption, ensuring gender equality. But to say that these are barriers to growth and therefore to Asia becoming the dominant driver of economic growth in the 21st century is something that I'm not fully convinced. I mean, you can still convince me, but I'm willing to be convinced because they're all desirable things. And it's always good, you feel good when the desirable becomes the necessary. But all I'm saying is that while it is desirable, it may not be necessary. Finally, I mean, I agree with Shyam about India, China, and I think Deng Xiaoping got it right. I think Xi Jinping will pay a price for not realizing the importance of Deng's observation that 21st century cannot be Asia's century without the peaceful rise of China and India. Now, their history does not support my argument because Europe had wars right through the 19th century and yet the European power was a dominant power through the 19th century. But exactly for reasons Shyam mentioned, the size of China, size of India, persistent conflict between the two will have damaging consequences for growth. Finally, I'm sure this is there in the book, I don't recall from my earlier reading of it, two factors which will determine whether in fact at the end of the century it is Asia's or not are demography and technology. Education, technology, knowledge. The United States growth over the last 20, 30 years has been driven by Asians. I mean, you look at the IT, Silicon Valley, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Chinese, the Indians, the entire technological revolution, not entire, okay, Facebook is an American, Google is an American, okay. But look at the Indian, Asian contribution to America's resurgence post-Vietnam, right? And so the fact that Asians have not done this for Europe is what has ensured Europe's decline. Europe's decline is because Europe did not understand the mantra from the United States that immigration is key to acceleration of growth in the knowledge era. China's rise is because of its investment in knowledge. Our rise will depend on how much investment. That is the biggest lacuna in India. I can live with inequality, I can live with bad sanitation, I can live with, but if you have not invested in knowledge, knowledge is key. By knowledge I mean education, technology, the works. China's rise entirely productivity driven. I mean China's growth, economic growth entirely productivity driven. Today we are dealing with an Indian economy where productivity is not rising because the levels of skills are so low. But as I said, I decided to say a lot of that to provoke some reaction. But as you very well know, we have been associated for a long time, greatly learned from your work on Asia, and therefore I'm really delighted that you put it together into a book rather than left it as 6 hanging lectures. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay, for again, as always, provoking thought and reflection on this. I have 2 options. I can. I have a whole series of thoughts in my head, again provoked by both the commentators, and I could also perhaps pose a few questions. But I think seeing the interest of the audience, I'm actually going to open it up already and start taking a few questions. I might pose one question to both, which is the nature of American politics, Shyam referred to it, and how that changes both the trajectory that China would like, but also, of course, the trajectory that India would like for itself, and that has to do also with the newfound relationship between Japan, the United States, and India, possibly with Australia as well, as part of a balancing force geostrategically in Asia. So that's one set of questions. The other set of questions that I had for Sanjay really were that yes, absolutely, the world was a simpler place, less complex, knowledge moved slowly, technology hardly moved for a very long time, and we are now in a very difficult situation where India has to both do a Swachh Bharat but also a Gyani Bharat, and we are not able to ride those 2 horses always very well at the same time. So those are at least 2 big thoughts in my head, but I'll just put them in the background and hope that we can come back to some of these. But I'd like to open it up for discussion with an audience like this. So I see a hand here and I saw a hand there. Yes, please.
Virat.
Can't hear you.
Button.
My name is Mukherjee. I am former professor of JNU. My question is addressed to Dr. Nag. Dr. Nag, do you visualize that there could be a possibility of a middle income trap? Because there are tailwinds on both the Chinese and the Indian side. The Chinese side, the most formidable one is the debt overhang, and I'm not aware that they are using their capital very productively. They are not. There is a lot of underutilized capacity. People are saying that there could be a burst. We have to see whether we get trapped in that or not. On Indian side, the tailwind is the banking crisis.